9:30 p.m. on the East Coast, and here's where we stand. Wisconsin has been called for President Obama, which brings the electoral numbers to 154 for Romney and 153 for Obama. Well, for more on this, let's bring back Mike Papantonio, attorney and co-host of Ring and Fire Radio. Hey, Mike, thanks for joining us tonight. Are you there? Do we have Mike? Oh, we do.
I am. How are you tonight?
There you go.
How
Great.
are you tonight?
Thanks a lot for joining us, Mike. What's your take on the length of lines? I am continually astounded by the fact that the corporate media, the mainstream media in the United States, is not reporting long lines particularly in minority districts, particularly in swing states, as what it is: election suppression or voter suppression, a variation in election fraud that's being done institutionally by Republicans in power in these states.
Well, isn't the bigger question is why does it happen when you have Republican governors? I mean, isn't that the bigger question?
Yeah.
Haven't we seen this in the past, Tom? Haven't we seen it when the Republicans were in charge of Ohio the last time? Haven't we seen it when Republicans were in charge of Florida the last time? So, I mean, look, there are some things that are more than temporal relationships. There are some things we look at and we can't ignore the facts. The media has done a very poor job. They talk in oblique terms about what voter suppression is, but here it's right in front of their eyes. And you know what, Tom? Tomorrow, regardless of what happens, and I do believe Obama is going to win. I really do believe that, based on the numbers that I'm seeing. But everybody's going to forget what happened here. They're going to forget that you had minority voters waiting 6 and 7 hours to vote, while just across the tracks, just across the bridge, the affluent white voter waited 15 minutes. They're going to forget that story, and then we're not going to do anything for the next 2 years until it occurs again. That's our nature. We want to believe that things take care of themselves. But all we have to do is look at history. There's no mistake about what we're seeing here. Go back and look at the history. This has happened before.
Well, I thought it was really interesting, too, Tom. Before we went on air, you were telling me on your radio show, your call-in show, that you had so many people calling in and reporting issues, many of them in Pennsylvania.
Freaking out. People in Pennsylvania saying that they showed up to vote and they were told that they were not registered to vote. One guy actually went home and looked up his registration online, and it was still there. And he went back to the precinct, and they said, no, we don't have it. It's like, who printed these books? And so you've got voter suppression or mistakes happening in Pennsylvania. Same thing in Ohio. We had African Americans calling up after Greg Palast came on and reported that they were given absentee ballots, which don't even get counted until later.
Yeah.
And I just had this avalanche of phone calls from largely African American people in Ohio saying, "Yep, that happened to me." This is nuts.
I mean, Pat, that's what I was going to ask you. Why aren't we hearing about this on the mainstream media? This is clearly happening.
Well, because it doesn't sell. You see, the mainstream media looks at this like as if this is a whiny story. People are whining because they have to wait. People are whining because the Republicans have simply tried to disenfranchise them. People are whining. The serious reporters, if you cover what Brad Friedman has done on this, another handful of great reporters that have been following this for years, take a look at what history shows us and then understand that those aren't stories that traditional media care about, because it takes some digging. It takes a little bit of effort to show, and you can graph this. We've done it on our show. We've created graphs for our show where we've talked about, all you have to do is go back and look at the history. Was there a Republican governor? Was there a Republican legislature? Was there an effort years before to try to figure out how to narrow the field of voters? And you'll see it. It's not, this isn't guesswork. This isn't whining. This is the very essence of democracy. When we get to the point to where traditional media is so damn dysfunctional that they don't understand that we're talking about the heart of democracy, and we seem willing to ignore those stories. Tomorrow, I promise you, there will not be stories that are meaningful stories that will last, that will have a shelf life of more than 1 week after this election, regardless of how abhorrent the conduct has been.
And that's just fundamentally wrong. Pap, you do a radio show with Robert Kennedy Jr., with Bobby Kennedy every week. You are in a law practice with him. You are very, very politically astute. So is he. I'm curious your just overview your analysis, your political analysis of what's happening tonight in the elections?
Well, I think what's happening is this, Tom. The Republicans picked too many wars. You can't pick a war on women, a war on labor, a war on the poor, a war on minorities, a war on the auto industry. You can't choose all these wars, a war on intellectualism, a war on gender choice. You have too many wars going on, and what it did is it took them away from the single focus. If you'll recall, we've all heard those magic words that came from James Carville's mouth during the Clinton years, and that is, it's the economy, stupid. They were incapable of focusing on that because they had a party that had become dysfunctional, Tom. It had been taken over by the lunatics. It had been taken over by the fringe lunatics, such as the weird evangelical right, the teabag movement. They were incapable of arriving at a simple theme. Instead, they picked wars with everybody. And I think we're going to see that play itself out tonight.
And I think if you really look at the numbers as they sort of ebbed and flowed during this campaign, some of the times when Romney was at his best, at his highest, for example, was right after that debate when we saw a very moderate Mitt Romney, when we saw somebody who wasn't trying to play to his base as much. What's going to be the takeaway if Governor Romney loses tonight? What is the takeaway for the Republican Party? Do they need to have a serious conversation about saying, hey, if we really want to win elections, and by the way, we might see this tonight in some of the Senate races. In Indiana, we saw, longtime Republican Senator Dick Lugar, lose his seat in the primaries. Yes. Will they have a conversation about maybe trying to play to the middle a little more?
They've tried to build a party with low-hanging fruit. And what they have to do is decide now they have to rebuild the infrastructure. They have to say no to the evangelical fringe that even Richard Nixon was wise enough to say, no, I don't want to be a part of that. They have to be willing to say no to this Tea Party fringe that's made them unable to be a legitimate political party. Now, look, we can take all of the individual stories that we've heard time and time again as this campaign has gone forward. But the point is, there is that air around this party, there's that aura around this party that is barely a legitimate party anymore because it has been overtaken by lunatics. They have lost control of their party. The people who have to rebuild that have to have the courage and the character to say, no, this is a party of Eisenhower again. This is a party at least of Barry Goldwater again. We are real conservatives. We're not lunatics who simply reach out to every fringe we can try to garner and bring them in as part of this new thing called the Tea Party GOP. But it's destructive.
It seems to me that this is a lesson that they've, had to learn time and time again. We've seen this. We saw this happen in a couple of the congressional races back in 2010, some of the special elections where, they ended up electing in the primary this sort of very right-wing or fringe person who then lost in the general election. So, I mean, what's it going to take for this just to be sort of the mainstream think in the Republican Party?
Until this party evolves away from the Lee Atwater days, Karl Rove is nothing more than a holdover from Lee Atwater.
He was a student of Lee Atwater.
He is a student of Lee Atwater, and until the turd blossom is asked to go away, that we don't want your caliber of politics. We want decent politics. We want to look like a party of decency again, where we include all Americans, where we understand we can't win an election by simply gathering all the low-hanging fruit in this country and expect it to be sustainable, especially in light of the fact that we're getting ready to see a major demographic change that's going to take place in the next 4 years. The reason they had to win tonight was because if they didn't have the chance to prepare for that 4 years where they could have made national changes that would have made it more difficult to vote, where they could have picked up more governorships that would have made it difficult to vote. They had to win tonight because they understand the numbers just like all of us do. We look at the numbers just like they do. And we see the Latino demographics changing, the African-American demographics changing. We see a generational shift that is remarkable, to where they can't count even to this day. They're not going to be able to count on going to places like Alabama and Mississippi and South Carolina and assuming that those are given locked states.
Yep.
Those are states that could come into play at some point.
And also they wanted to nail down the Supreme Court. We have 4 members of the Supreme Court over in their 70s, 3 of them over 75 years old. That's a BFD coming up. By the way, New Hampshire has just been called by CBS News for President Obama, a swing state. And also Indiana, Representative Joe Donnelly is being called by Fox as the winner of the Senate seat, replacing Senator Richard Lugar, we were talking about just a moment ago. The count now, 157 electoral votes for President Obama, 154 for Governor Romney. Pap, in the minute we have left, I'm just curious your thoughts. You were going through your list, your thoughts on the Supreme Court going forward.
Well, the Supreme Court, if we can change what's happening right now. If Obama's elected, we can reverse the dismal, awful events that have taken place on a Supreme Court that they're not really judges. They become political hacks. The majority is nothing more than political hacks. We can change that if Obama will do what he's been unwilling to do, and that is jump in and be aggressive with all the courts, the federal courts at every level, trial level, appellate level, all the way to the Supreme Court. It's something he's misunderstood from the time he took office, and now we're all paying for that.
In just a couple of quick words, does it concern you that there's nobody, or I think maybe one person on the court, who actually has any criminal law experience?
Well, it's worse than that. It's beyond that. If you look at most of them come from hugely political ideology. They're political hacks in true sense. I don't use that word lightly. They simply are people who've come through the political ladder. They've been promoted through the political ladder. Most of them have very, very undistinguished judicial backgrounds, not just in criminal, but in civil as well.
All right, Mike Papantonio, I want to thank you so much for joining us once again this evening.
Thank you. Thanks.